Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we bring forgotten pieces of American history back to life. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss one of our historical tales. Now, let's begin the summer of 1841 in Hartford. Connecticut was the kind of season that made neighbors linger by garden fences and church doors long after the Sunday bells had rung. The town itself was a growing place, busy with trade along the Connecticut River, but still intimate enough that nearly everyone knew one another's business. Weddings were especially important, not just to families, but to the entire town. They were public events, occasions where the whole community could share in joy, gossip, and sometimes envy. On a bright June morning that year, the town had turned its attention toward the upcoming wedding of John Robinson and Mary Wilcox. John was the son of a respectable merchant family, known for his steady nature and ambition. Mary was the only daughter of a widow, Mrs. Prudence Wilcox, whose husband had died some years before. Prudence was well known in Hartford, sharp-tongued, stern, and controlling. She lived her life with a kind of cold efficiency, running her household with exacting standards. Some admired her strength, while others whispered that she was a woman impossible to please. The match between John and Mary seemed perfect. He brought financial security and social standing, while she offered kindness, grace, and a beauty that made her the pride of her mother's household. Yet beneath the smiles and preparations, a darker tension stirred quietly, felt most deeply by Mary herself. For though Mary had given her heart to John, her mother had never approved of the match. Prudence Wilcox wanted her daughter to marry someone of even higher standing, someone who could elevate the family's name. She made no effort to hide her disappointment that Mary had chosen John. To the townsfolk, Prudence smiled politely and spoke of her daughter's happiness, but within her home she carried an air of bitterness. Mary's choice, in her eyes, was nothing short of betrayal. Still, the wedding went forward. Hartford prepared for the grand occasion. The churchyard was decorated with garlands. Families polished their best shoes. A feast was planned at the Wilcox home after the ceremony. Neighbors who had not spoken to one another in months suddenly remembered to exchange warm greetings. Because a wedding was more than just two lives joined, it was a marker of time, a story that bound the whole community together. Mary, however, felt a shadow pressing over her joy. She noticed the way her mother's eyes hardened whenever she mentioned John's name. She noticed how Prudence never missed an opportunity to remind her daughter of what she could have had she chosen differently. And though Mary loved her mother, she felt a tightening fear inside her chest, as if some unspoken danger lurked just beyond reach. On the morning of the wedding, the Robinson family gathered with pride. John stood in his black coat, nervous but eager, while Mary in her simple white gown glowed with the innocence of a young bride. The church was filled, the vows spoken, the community rejoiced. Bells rang out across Hartford, and the sound carried through the streets like a promise of new beginnings. But the true heart of the day, at least for the people of Hartford, was not only the ceremony, it was the feast to follow. In those days, a wedding banquet was a sign of prosperity, generosity, and family honor, and no one wanted to host a feast more memorable than Prudence Wilcox. The Wilcox home stood ready, its long dining table set with care. Steaming dishes of roasted meats, buttered breads, pies, and puddings were laid out in abundance. Guests praised the preparations, remarking that Prudence had spared no expense. She moved among them with a kind of forced grace, accepting compliments with a stiff nod, her lips thin and unsmiling. It was during this feast, amid laughter and clinking glasses, that fate turned cruel. At first, it was only a few guests who complained of stomach pains. They excused themselves quietly, stepping outside for air. But soon others followed. Children cried as their parents doubled over, clutching their bellies. The sounds of celebration turned into gasps and shouts. Panic rippled across the room. Mary, still in her gown, rushed to her husband's side as John collapsed to the floor, his face pale and his body trembling. Servants scrambled to fetch water, but nothing helped. Within minutes, the joyous feast had become a scene of horror. Guests vomited, writhed, and cried out in pain. By evening, several were dead. Others hovered near death, their bodies failing under the mysterious sickness. The town doctor, called in desperation, examined the victims. His grim conclusion spread like wildfire through Hartford. It was not illness, but poison. Whispers turned to accusations. Some suspected a servant, others wondered if spoiled food was to blame. Yet suspicion soon fell closer to home. Too many remembered the sharpness in Prudence Wilcox's manner, her displeasure over her daughter's choice of husband. Too many had seen her hovering near the dishes before the feast began. Mary herself could not ignore what her heart already feared. She had seen her mother earlier that day, moving quietly through the kitchen with a small vial in her hand. At the time, she had dismissed it, convincing herself it was medicine or a tonic. But now, with her husband gasping for breath beside her, her mother's face looked different, calm, almost detached, as if she were watching something long planned unfold. The truth, unspoken but heavy in every heart, began to take form. The Hartford wedding had not been cursed by chance or spoiled meat. It had been touched by a mother's hand, a hand that could not bear to see her daughter wed a man she did not approve. As the night deepened, lanterns flickered across the Wilcox home. Families carried away their sick. The dead were laid out with prayers and tears. And in the silence that followed, Hartford knew it had witnessed something unnatural, something wicked that would stain its history forever. But the story was far from over. For what began as whispers in that dining hall would grow into a scandal that shook the town to its core. And at the center of it all stood a mother whose secret was too heavy to hide, and a daughter who would be forced to reckon with love, betrayal, and the darkest truth a family could hold. The sun rose over Hartford the morning after the wedding, but it seemed to shine on a town already changed. The bells that had so cheerfully rung out for John and Mary the day before now tolled in sorrow. At least 6 people had died during the night, their bodies racked by the poison that had turned a day of joy into a nightmare. Others lay ill in their homes, hovering between life and death. The Wilcox household, once filled with chatter and laughter, was now a place of whispers, suspicion, and grief. Mary sat at her husband's bedside, his body still trembling, his breath shallow. His strong frame, once so full of life, looked fragile now, like it might give way at any moment. She pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, her wedding gown discarded in a heap on the floor, stained with tears and dirt from the terrible night. She whispered prayers over and over, begging God not to take him from her, not on the very day their lives together were supposed to begin. Downstairs, Prudence Wilcox moved with a strange calmness. She ordered the servants to clean, to scrub the table, to burn the remnants of food. She scolded one girl for crying too loudly, warning her that hysteria would only make things worse. To the neighbors who gathered outside the Wilcox gate, Prudence appeared strong, almost unshaken. Some admired her composure, while others whispered that it seemed unnatural. A mother who had just watched her daughter's wedding turn to tragedy. Shouldn't she be broken with grief? Shouldn't she be weeping? Word spread quickly through Hartford. By noon, the town's leaders gathered. The local doctor, Dr. Elias Partridge, was summoned to speak of what he had seen. He described violent sickness, the vomiting, the convulsions, the unmistakable signs of arsenic poisoning. At his words, gasps filled the room. Arsenic was not unknown to the people of Hartford. It was a poison kept in households for killing rats and pests. But to see it used in such a way, to take lives at a wedding table, was beyond comprehension. The townspeople demanded answers. Who had brought the poison? Who had mixed it into the food? Suspicion turned quickly to the Wilcox kitchen, to the cooks and servants who had prepared the feast. Some were questioned, their hands trembling as they swore they knew nothing of arsenic being near the food. Others said they had seen Mrs. Wilcox herself in the kitchen more often than usual that day. One boy, no older than 12, claimed he saw her pour something into a dish before the guests arrived. The townsfolk dismissed his words at first, thinking him confused, but whispers grow heavy when they match the fears already lurking in people's minds. Meanwhile, Mary wrestled with her own torment. She could not forget the sight of her mother's hand clutching that small vial in the hours before the feast. The image haunted her clearer now than it had been in the rush of wedding nerves. She wanted to deny it, to convince herself it was all a mistake, that her mother could never do such a thing. But when she looked into Prudence's eyes, she saw no sorrow there, no remorse. She saw only a stillness, a coldness that frightened her more than the sickness that had struck her guests. On the second day after the poisoning, Hartford was no longer a town of celebration, but a town of mourning. Coffins were carried down the streets, the churchyard filled with grieving families. The Robinsons, too, prepared for the worst, as John lingered between life and death. Mary refused to leave his side. She barely ate, barely slept. Her once bright spirit dimmed, her voice broken from constant prayer. The townsfolk, though, were not content to mourn in silence. They wanted justice. They wanted someone to blame. The magistrates began their investigation. Servants were brought forward again, their stories repeated and compared. A jar of sugar from the Wilcox kitchen was tested, its crystals tainted with the bitter trace of arsenic. That jar, they learned, had been used in the wedding cakes and puddings served at the feast. When confronted, Prudence Wilcox did not falter. She claimed ignorance, said the servants must have been careless, that she could not be expected to watch every hand in her kitchen. But her words fell flat. The townsfolk remembered too clearly how she had frowned upon John Robinson, how she had spoken against the marriage. They remembered her stern warnings to Mary, her bitter mutterings about throwing one's life away. The suspicion that had begun as whispers now swelled into open talk. Mothers warned their children not to take sweets from Mrs. Wilcox's hand. Men spoke in taverns, saying the woman was capable of anything. And yet, because of her standing, because of her careful composure, no one dared accuse her, outright not yet. Mary, caught between love for her mother and loyalty to her husband, lived in agony. She longed to confront Prudence, to demand the truth, but fear held her tongue. What if her mother admitted it? What if she denied it and turned her coldness upon her own daughter? And most of all, what if the town was forced to choose between mercy for a widow of standing and justice for the dead? One evening, as the summer air grew heavy and the cicadas sang in the trees, Mary overheard her mother speaking in hushed tones to a neighbor. Prudence's voice was calm, almost too calm, as she insisted that the poison must have come from some accident, perhaps a spoiled batch of flour or sugar brought in by the Robinson family themselves. The neighbor nodded, but Mary saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. She knew then that her mother was not just innocent or guilty, she was fighting to control the story, to bend the truth before it hardened against her. But the truth has a way of seeping through cracks, no matter how tightly one tries to seal them. A servant girl, frightened into honesty, confessed that she had seen Mrs. Wilcox sprinkle something into the sugar jar days before the wedding. Another neighbor remembered Prudence buying arsenic from the apothecary weeks earlier, claiming it was to rid the house of rats. Piece by piece, the tale built itself, until it no longer belonged to whispers, but to the very fabric of Hartford's gossip and grief. Still, the law was slow to act. The magistrates hesitated, knowing that to accuse a woman like Prudence Wilcox of murder would bring scandal upon the town. Some even feared her influence, for she had friends among Hartford's wealthier families. But the common folk were less forgiving. At every funeral, eyes turned toward her with quiet rage. Children spoke her name in hushed tones, as though she were a witch out of old stories. For Mary, each day was a torment beyond telling. She sat by her husband's sickbed, holding his hand, whispering love into his ear, all the while knowing her mother's shadow hung over them. She looked at Prudence and wondered, was this truly a mother's love, twisted and dark, or was it hatred disguised as protection? The nights grew longer, filled with weeping from households across Hartford. The tragedy bound the town in grief, but it also bound them in suspicion, each day inching closer to the truth. And as John Robinson's breaths grew shallower, as the last strength seemed to leave his body, Mary realized that the secret she carried in her heart, the memory of that vial in her mother's hand, would not stay hidden forever. It was only a matter of time before the truth broke free, and when it did, Hartford would never forget the name Prudence Wilcox. By midsummer, the Wilcox home no longer stood as a place of honor in Hartford. It stood as a house watched. Neighbors lingered when passing by, their eyes fixed on the windows, hoping to catch some sign, some proof of what they already believed in their hearts. The once proud Prudence Wilcox now lived in a cage of whispers. The funerals of the wedding guests had hardened suspicion into certainty. Each coffin lowered into the ground was a silent accusation, each hymn sung over the dead, another thread tying her name to their fate. Mothers who had once greeted her politely now turned away in the street. Men who had once tipped their hats in respect now muttered darkly about justice being delayed. Children dared each other to creep to her gate at night, whispering that the woman inside had murdered her own daughter's future. John Robinson still lingered, though barely. His body had been stripped of strength by the poison, and each day seemed to bring him closer to the grave. Mary sat beside him night and day, her hands folded over his, her eyes swollen from tears. She felt as though she were living in two worlds. At once one of love and devotion to the man who had become her husband, and another of terror, where her own mother's shadow reached into the sick room, like a hand closing around his throat. The town could not ignore the matter any longer. At last, the magistrates called for an inquiry. The hearing was held in the meeting hall, a place usually reserved for town debates and gatherings, but now it filled with a different kind of energy, one of accusation, anger, and anticipation. Families of the dead sat together, their faces drawn and hollow. Ordinary townsfolk crowded into every corner, hungry to hear the truth spoken aloud. Prudence Wilcox walked into that hall with her back straight and her eyes cold. She wore a black dress, her bonnet tied neatly under her chin. She gave no outward sign of fear. Some said she looked like a widow, at a funeral perhaps her own. Mary, trembling, sat behind her, her hands twisting in her lap, torn between loyalty to the woman who had raised her and horror at what that woman might have done. The testimonies began. Dr. Partridge spoke first, his words measured but grim. He described the symptoms of the victims, the unmistakable signs of arsenic. He held up a small vial taken from the Wilcox home, its contents tested and found to be poison. The room stirred, men shifting in their seats, women clutching their shawls tighter. Then came the servants. One after another, they spoke of strange things they had seen in the days before the wedding. The sugar jar tampered with. Prudence herself, insisting on preparing certain dishes with her own hands, though she had rarely touched the cooking before. The boy who had seen her pouring something into the jar was called forward. His voice shook, but his words carried the weight of innocence. I saw her do it. I saw Mrs. Wilcox pour the powder. Gasps filled the hall. All eyes turned to Prudence, but she did not flinch. She rose slowly, her voice calm and steady as she answered. She said the boy was mistaken, that children's eyes play tricks. She said she had bought arsenic, yes, but only to rid her home of rats. She said any tampering with the sugar must have been done by careless servants, not by her hand. She spoke with such certainty, such practiced firmness, that for a moment even those most convinced of her guilt felt a flicker of doubt. But doubt does not silence grief. Mothers who had buried their children stood and wept aloud. Fathers muttered curses under their breath. The magistrates struggled to restore order, but the fury of the people could not be contained. Mary sat frozen, her heart torn. She wanted to cry out, to tell the truth of what she had seen, the vial in her mother's hand, the calmness in her eyes as guests collapsed around her. But the words stuck in her throat like thorns. How could she condemn her own mother? How could she speak words that would forever brand her family with shame? And yet, how could she remain silent, knowing that silence might cost her husband his life? The inquiry dragged on for hours. Neighbors testified of Prudence's disapproval of the marriage, her harsh words about John Robinson. Others spoke of her pride, her unyielding nature. Piece by piece, the portrait painted itself. A woman who could not bear to see her daughter wed beneath her station, who would rather see a feast turn to funerals than her own pride humbled. Still, no final judgment was made. The magistrates, fearful of condemning a woman of standing without irrefutable proof, declared the case unresolved. They said further evidence must be sought. But the people of Hartford needed no further evidence. In their eyes, the verdict was already written. From that day, Prudence Wilcox was a woman alone. Families crossed the street to avoid her. Shopkeepers served her in silence. The church pew where she once sat stood empty, for no one wished to pray beside her. And Mary, sweet Mary, whose heart was breaking, found herself trapped between the town's hatred for her mother and her desperate love for her husband. At night, when the candles burned low and the house creaked with silence, Mary sometimes thought she heard her mother moving softly through the halls, as though guarding some secret locked inside her soul. She longed to ask her, to beg her for the truth. But whenever she opened her mouth, Prudence's cold eyes silenced her. One evening, as John's breathing grew ragged, Mary could no longer bear it. She turned to her mother, her voice trembling. "Mother," she whispered, Did you put it in the food? Did you do this?" For a long moment, Prudence said nothing. She stared at her daughter, her face unreadable. Then, in a voice low and sharp, she answered, "You think you know love, child? You think it means clinging to that man as if he is your whole world. But you do not know what it means to protect your family's name, to sacrifice for it. One day, you will understand." Mary's blood ran cold. It was not a confession, not outright, but it was no denial either. It was a mother speaking of sacrifice, of pride, of something so twisted it chilled her daughter's very soul. The weight of that moment settled over Mary like a stone. She knew then that the truth, whether spoken or not, had already poisoned not just the wedding feast, but her entire life. She looked at John, pale and gasping, and felt a terror she had never known before, that love itself might be devoured by her mother's pride, and that no prayer could undo what had been done. And outside, in the streets of Hartford, the townsfolk whispered of justice left undone, of a mother's hand that had brought death to a wedding feast. They swore they would not forget. They swore the name Wilcox would forever be tied to poison. The story was not finished, for what lay ahead was darker still. The slow unraveling of a family, the torment of a daughter forced to choose between truth and blood, and the legacy of a town that carried the scar of the Hartford wedding, poisoning long after the coffins were buried. The summer waned into autumn, but Hartford remained a town haunted by what had taken place at the Wilcox home. The air itself seemed heavy, as though the poison that had killed so many still lingered in the streets, clinging to the walls of houses, seeping into whispers at market stalls and churchyards. The people tried to move on, for life in a town must go on, but the Hartford wedding was never far from their thoughts. At the center of this quiet storm sat Mary Robinson. Once Mary Wilcox, who had stepped into marriage only to find herself torn between two unbearable truths. Each day she sat at John's bedside, watching him fade, praying for a miracle. Each night she listened to her mother's footsteps pacing the halls, steady and unhurried, as if Prudence felt no guilt, no weight at all, for the deaths that had torn the community apart. John's strength dwindled as the weeks passed. His once strong hands grew thin, the veins rising like cords beneath his skin. He spoke little now, his voice barely above a whisper, but when he did, his words cut into Mary's heart. "Mary," he breathed one evening, his eyes cloudy with pain, "I dreamt of our life together, of children, of a home filled with laughter. I still dream of it, but I feel it slipping away." Mary gripped his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. "No, John, don't speak like that. You will live. You must live." But deep in her soul, she felt the truth pressing in. The poison had stolen more than their wedding day. It was stealing the very life they had barely begun. And still, Prudence showed no sign of breaking. She moved through the house as if nothing had happened, keeping her back straight, her face hard. If grief touched her, she hid it beneath layers of pride. To Mary, this hardness was more terrible than any open confession. It was as though her mother believed her actions justified, as though saving her daughter from a marriage she deemed unworthy outweighed the blood of the dead and the suffering of the living. The people of Hartford, however, would not let the matter rest. They had not forgotten the funerals, the wailing of mothers, the hollow eyes of fathers who had carried their children to early graves. The magistrates might hesitate, the law might falter, but the town itself held its judgment. Prudence Wilcox was marked in every glance, every whisper. Her presence was enough to still conversation in any room. She became a figure not merely disliked, but feared. By the time the leaves began to fall from the trees, Hartford no longer treated her as one of its own. She sat alone in her pew at church when she dared to go. She walked the streets with eyes fixed straight ahead, ignoring the cold shoulders and turned backs. And Mary, caught between her mother and her husband, felt herself breaking under the strain. It was in October that the final blow came. John Robinson, after months of suffering, finally succumbed. He died quietly in his sleep, Mary's hand in his, a faint smile on his lips, as though he had drifted into the dreams of the life he had hoped to live. Mary's cry rang out through the house like the tearing of cloth, raw and heart-wrenching, and the town, though they had expected the news, received it with heavy hearts. Another life lost to the poison. Another nail driven into the coffin of Prudence Wilcox's reputation. The funeral was held under gray skies. The Robinson family buried their son with dignity, though their grief was tinged with quiet fury. Mary stood in black, her veil drawn, her body trembling. Her mother stood beside her, stiff and unbending, her lips pressed thin. If tears fell from her eyes, no one saw them. That night, Mary finally spoke the words she had carried in silence for too long. She went to her mother, her hands shaking, her voice trembling. "Mother," she said, "I loved him, and you killed him. You may not have placed the poison on his lips with your own hand, but you gave it to him all the same. You killed my husband, and you killed the others too. I can't protect you anymore. I won't." Prudence's eyes flashed with something sharp, though her voice remained steady. "You speak like a child, Mary. You think I am cruel, but I have only ever done what is necessary. You married beneath yourself. You were ready to throw away everything for love. And what has it brought you? Misery, suffering. I spared you worse. Mary stared at her mother with horror. Spared me worse? You spared me nothing. You took everything. For me, I will never forgive you. Never. For the first time, Prudence faltered. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. And in that silence, Mary turned and walked away, leaving her mother alone in the cold, dark house. From that day forward, a bond between them was broken. Mary moved into the Robinson home, where she was welcomed as a grieving widow, her sorrow shared by those who had loved John. Prudence remained in her house, surrounded by whispers, shunned by the town she once commanded. Years passed, but the memory of the Hartford wedding poisoning never faded. Children who had been too young to remember grew up hearing the story. The name Wilcox became a warning spoken in hushed tones. Mothers used it as a lesson. Beware of pride, beware of anger, beware of those who put honor above love. Prudence Wilcox lived on, but her life was a slow exile. Though never convicted by the law, she was condemned by the people, condemned by her own daughter's silence, condemned by the legacy of a day meant for joy turned to tragedy. She died alone, her name forever tied to poison, her house abandoned and left to decay. Mary lived with her grief, carrying the memory of John until her own final days. She never remarried, never forgot the sound of his voice or the dreams they had once shared. And though she rarely spoke of her mother, when she did, it was with a quiet sorrow, not just for what was lost, but for the love twisted into something so dark, it destroyed everything it touched out, and so the Hartford Wedding Poisoning of 1841 passed into history, not simply as a tale of death, but as a lesson carved deep into the memory of a town. A story of pride that became poison, of love destroyed by a mother's hand, of how one family's secret can become a community's curse. The people of Hartford never forgot it. And even now, more than a century later, the story lingers, a reminder that sometimes the darkest crimes are not committed by strangers, but by those closest to us, hiding behind the mask of love.